For 3 centuries, the Galactic Council had maintained peace through endless negotiations, careful diplomacy, and the firm belief that any conflict could be resolved through patient discussion. Wars were extinct. Violence was a relic of primitive civilizations. Every species had learned to settle their differences at the vast negotiation tables that floated in the neutral zones between star systems. Every species except one. Humans had been the newest members, arriving with their strange insistence on something they called justice and their disturbing tendency to ask uncomfortable questions. For 57 years, they had sat through the endless talks, their delegates growing quieter with each passing session. The other species barely noticed when the human chairs began to empty, one by one. They should have paid attention, because when the last human delegate stood up, gathered his papers, and walked away for the peace talks forever, he left behind more than just an empty chair. He left behind a warning that would echo across the galaxy. You've forgotten that peace isn't the absence of war. It's the presence of justice. And we're done waiting for you to remember. The council laughed. After all, what could one small species do against the combined might of thousands of civilized worlds? They were about to find out. What happens when humanity decides that sometimes the only way to achieve true peace is to first remind the galaxy why war was something to be feared? This is the story of how everything changed the moment humans quit the peace talks. Ambassador Sarah Chun had been sitting in the same chair for 6 hours and 37 minutes. Around her, the massive crystal chamber of negotiation platform 7 hummed with the voices of 412 different species, each speaking in their native tongue, while universal translators rendered their words into something resembling meaning. The Valkyrie delegation was arguing about mining rights on a dead moon that hadn't seen life for millennia. The Threen were demanding compensation for a trade route that passed within 3 light years of their territory, claiming it violated their ancestral flying patterns. Sarah pressed her fingers to her temples and tried to remember why Earth had wanted to join this circus in the first place. The Galactic Council represents the pinnacle of civilized discourse, Director Hamilton had told her during her briefing 3 years ago. 57 years of human participation have proven our commitment to peaceful resolution. We're finally being taken seriously. Being taken seriously apparently meant listening to the Gromax ambassador spend 47 minutes explaining why their moon-sized cargo ships needed exclusive rights to 17 different shipping lanes because their cultural beliefs required them to travel in perfect circles. Meanwhile, the Deltari colonies have been under siege by Zenth raiders for 8 months, and every time Sarah brought it up, the discussion was postponed pending the formation of a subcommittee to explore the formation of another subcommittee. The Deltari were human allies. Their children were dying. Ambassador Chun, the melodious voice of Council Moderator Vethkyle, flowed through the chamber's acoustic systems. The tall, crystalline being's faceted head turned toward her with something that might have been benevolent interest. The Terran delegation has been remarkably quiet today. Do you wish to contribute to our discussion of the Gromax shipping concerns? Sarah looked around the massive chamber. Beings of every conceivable shape and size filled the floating platforms that circled the central speaking floor. Some were energy patterns barely contained in environmental suits. Others were massive, slug-like creatures that communicated through color changes in their skin. The diversity was breathtaking, and each one of them seemed perfectly content to talk endlessly about everything except the things that actually mattered. I'd like to return to the Deltari situation, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the translation system. A ripple of what sounded like sighs echoed through the chamber. The Valkyrie ambassador's tentacles writhed in apparent annoyance. 3 different species began speaking at once, their translated voices overlapping in a cacophony of bureaucratic protest. Ambassador Chun, Vethkyle's voice rose above the noise, bringing silence. As discussed in sessions 437 through 492, the Deltari matter has been referred to the Subcommittee for the Evaluation of Territorial Disputes involving previously uncontacted species. Their report is expected within 18 to 24 months. Children are dying right now, Sarah said simply. All loss of life is regrettable. The moderator replied with the smooth efficiency of someone who had given this response countless times. However, the proper procedures must be followed. Hasty action leads to greater suffering. Surely humanity, having experienced the consequences of premature military action in your own past, understands this principle. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Around her, the assembled delegates nodded or performed whatever gesture their species used to indicate agreement. The Threen delegation's feathers ruffled approvingly. The Gromax ambassador's eye stalks swiveled in what she had learned was their equivalent of sage nodding. They were using humanity's own violent history against her. Against Earth. Against everyone who believed that sometimes action was better than endless discussion. The Zenth Raiders have destroyed 14 settlements in the past month, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. They're not interested in negotiations. They're not going to wait for your subcommittee report. Every day we sit here debating shipping routes. More people die. Ambassador. Vethkal's tone carried a note of gentle reproof. Emotional responses are precisely what we have evolved beyond. The Zenth situation, while locally significant, must be viewed in the broader context of galactic stability. A rash military response could destabilize 7 different sectors and lead to conflicts that might last centuries. What if we just defended the settlements? Sarah asked. No attacks, no invasions. Just protection. Any military presence in the region would be seen as provocation. The Valkyrie ambassador interjected, its translated voice carrying tones of absolute certainty. The Zenth might interpret defensive forces as preparation for offensive action. This could escalate the situation beyond control. Sarah looked around the chamber again. These beings had created a system where defending innocent people was considered provocation, where asking for justice was seen as emotional instability, where the only acceptable response to violence was to form a committee to think about maybe forming another committee to possibly consider discussing the situation in a few years. How many times has this council authorized military action in the past century? She asked. The chamber fell silent. Even the background hum of translation systems seemed to quiet. Ambassador Chun, Vethkal, said carefully, the absence of military authorization is precisely what we celebrate. We have achieved peace through negotiation. No, Sarah said, standing slowly from her chair. You've achieved the absence of accountability through endless delay. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several species began speaking in urgent undertones. The Valkyrie ambassador's tentacles were now writhing in what she recognized as extreme agitation. Ambassador, please, Vethkal raised one crystalline hand. These accusations are both unfounded and unhelpful. The Council has successfully resolved thousands of disputes through patient negotiation. Name one, Sarah said. I beg your pardon? Name one significant dispute you've actually resolved. One instance where this council took decisive action that protected innocent lives or stopped genuine aggression. The silence stretched longer this time. Sarah could see delegates looking at each other, presumably checking their records or consulting with their staffs. The Gromax ambassadors' eye stalks swiveled frantically. The Threen were preening their feathers with what looked like nervous energy. The corridor wars of 2387 were successfully mediated. Vethkal finally offered. After 30 years of negotiations, Sarah replied immediately, during which time the original disputed territory was rendered uninhabitable and both sides eventually agreed to avoid it entirely. You didn't solve the conflict. You let it burn itself out. More murmurs. The temperature in the chamber seemed to be rising, though that might have been Sarah's imagination. The trade route disputes of the Centauri sector, another voice offered, resolved when both sides discovered new routes that made the original dispute irrelevant, Sarah countered. Again, not solved, just made obsolete by circumstances beyond your control. She was walking now, moving toward the central platform where the moderator floated in his crystalline chair. Her footsteps echoed in the vast chamber, each step seeming louder than the last. The Zelanki border incident. The Zelanki went extinct while you were debating whether their claims had merit. That brought absolute silence. The Zelanki extinction was a sensitive subject. They had been a small species, insectoid, and fragile, asking for protection from corporate mining operations that were slowly poisoning their home system. The council had spent 7 years examining their claims. By the time they reached a decision to express concern about the situation, there were no Zelanki left to express concern to. Sarah reached the central platform and looked up at Vethkal. The moderator's crystalline features were impossible to read, but his stillness suggested surprise or alarm. "You don't resolve conflicts," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "You manage them. You contain them. You delay them until they either resolve themselves or the people involved give up or die. You've created a system where the only way to get justice is to wait until everyone who wanted justice is dead." "Ambassador Chun." Vethkal's voice carried a warning tone. "These accusations border on the inappropriate. The Council's record of maintaining galactic peace is beyond dispute." "Peace," Sarah repeated, looking around the chamber. "You keep using that word. But peace isn't just the absence of open warfare. Peace is justice. Peace is protection for the innocent. Peace is the ability to live without fear. What you've created isn't peace. It's paralysis." She reached in her jacket and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Her credentials, her diplomatic authorizations, her formal recognition as Earth's representative to the Galactic Council. "The human delegation withdraws from these negotiations," she said, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs that had begun to ripple through the chamber. "Effective immediately." The papers hit the floor of the central platform with a slap that seemed to echo forever. "Ambassador." Vethkal's voice cracked like breaking crystal. "You cannot simply withdraw. There are procedures, protocols. This requires a formal review period of no less than 6 months, with appropriate documentation submitted in triplicate to the relevant subcommittees." Sarah turned to look at him one last time. "Subcommittees. Always with the subcommittees. You want to know what humans are going to do while you're forming your subcommittee to review our withdrawal? We're going to go defend some innocent people who need defending." She walked toward the exit, her footsteps the only sound in the vast chamber. 412 species watched her go, and not one of them moved to stop her. At the exit, she paused and turned back. "You had 57 years to learn what humanity could teach you about justice and courage," she said. "Since you weren't interested in the lesson, we'll provide a demonstration instead." The chamber doors closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire platform. Behind her, Vethkal frantically called for order as 412 delegates began talking at once, their voices creating a chaos that the translation systems couldn't parse. Emergency protocols were invoked. Subcommittees were immediately formed to address the crisis of a delegation withdrawing without proper authorization. None of them understood that the real crisis hadn't begun yet. Sarah Chun walked through the docking bay where a transport waited, already knowing that her next stop would be the Deltari colonies. Humanity had spent 57 years learning how the galaxy conducted business. Now it was time to show them how Earth solved problems when talking wasn't enough. The galaxy was about to remember why some species were feared as well as respected. As her ship lifted off from the platform, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. After 57 years of endless talk, it felt good to finally take action. She had no idea that her walk across that chamber floor would be remembered as the moment everything changed. The first Zenth raiding fleet never saw the humans coming. Captain Marcus Rodriguez floated in the command center of the U.S. Defiance, watching his tactical display with the patience of a predator. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Chun walked out of the Galactic Council, and Earth had spent every one of those months preparing for this moment. The Zenth had grown bold in their raids against the Deltari colonies, confident that no one would intervene while the galaxy's governments debated proper procedures. That confidence was about to cost them everything. "Sensor sweep complete, Captain," reported Lieutenant Kim from her position at the scanning station. 18 Zenth raiders currently attacking Settlement Gamma 7. Standard pattern attack. They're herding the population into collection areas. Marcus studied the data flowing across his screens. The Zenth were efficient. He had to give them that. They would hit a settlement, round up everyone they could capture, strip anything of value, and disappear before any organized response could arrive. It was a strategy that worked perfectly against an enemy committed to following proper channels and diplomatic protocols. Unfortunately for the Zenth, humans had never been particularly good at following proper channels. What's their defensive posture? Marcus asked. Minimal, kim replied. 2 guard ships on perimeter watch, but they're positioned for early warning against planetary defense forces. They're not scanning for deep space approach vectors. Marcus nodded. Of course they weren't. In 3 centuries of galactic peace, no one attacked anyone anymore. Combat was something that happened in carefully controlled environments under strictly monitored conditions, with neutral observers and predetermined rules of engagement. The idea of simply appearing in a system and opening fire was so archaic that most species had stopped preparing for it entirely. Humans remembered how to do archaic. All ships, this is Defiance Actual. Marcus spoke into his communication system. Target designation is confirmed. Attack pattern Delta 7. Remember the rules of engagement. We're here to stop raiders, not start a war. Across the tactical display, 6 other human vessels began moving into position. They were small ships by galactic standards, fast and heavily armed, designed for exactly this kind of operation. Earth had been building them quietly for months, while the rest of humanity's fleet engaged in more visible preparations that had attracted the galaxy's attention. The Galactic Council thought humanity was mobilizing its entire military. They were partly right, but they had completely missed the creation of these smaller, specialized vessels that appeared on no official manifest and carried no diplomatic identification. Captain, Kim's voice carried a note of concern. I'm picking up civilian transmissions from the surface. The Deltari are requesting immediate assistance. The Zenth they're executing people to motivate the others to cooperate faster. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This was why the Council's endless delays were worse than useless. While they formed subcommittees to study the situation, real people died real deaths that could have been prevented with decisive action. All ships, this is Defiance Actual. Execute attack pattern Delta 7. Authorization Omega 17. The human fleet moved as one. The Zenth perimeter guards died without ever knowing they were under attack. Human vessels had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, coasted in on minimal power while hiding in the sensor shadows of asteroids and debris, and struck with weapons the Zenth couldn't even detect until it was too late. First perimeter cleared, reported the captain of the UES Vengeance. Moving to secondary targets. Confirmed Vengeance. All vessels begin Phase 2. The main Zenth fleet was concentrating around Settlement Gamma 7, their ships forming a protective screen while their ground forces worked. It was a standard formation that would have been effective against any conventional attack. The Deltari Planetary Defense Forces, if they had possessed any, would have been forced to approach directly through the Zenth defensive line, taking casualties while the raiders finished their work and escaped. Humans didn't approach directly. Tactical, give me a firing solution on the command ship, Marcus ordered. Sir, the command ship is surrounded by civilian vessels from the colony. Any direct attack risks collateral damage. Who said anything about a direct attack? Target the gravitational anchor holding their ship in position relative to the settlement. Make them choose between maintaining formation and falling into the planet's gravity well. On the tactical display, the UES Retribution fired a single, precisely aimed shot at a point in space that appeared to contain nothing important. The Zenth command ship immediately began drifting out of position as its gravitational anchor failed, forcing it to engage its engines and break formation to avoid falling toward the planet below. Now, Retribution, take out their engines while they're maneuvering. The second shot was equally precise. The Zenth command ship found itself floating helplessly in space, its propulsion systems destroyed, but its life support intact. On the planet below, the Zenth ground forces suddenly, found themselves without orbital support or evacuation capability. This is Captain Rodriguez of the United Earthship Defiance. To all Zenth forces in this system, Marcus broadcast on all frequencies. You are conducting illegal raids against civilians under the protection of Earth. You have 30 seconds to stand down and surrender, or we will consider you hostile combatants. The response came in the form of disruptor fire from the remaining Zenth ships, their weapons designed to tear through the hulls of cargo vessels and civilian transports. Against military-grade human shields, the effect was barely noticeable. "I suppose that's their answer," Marcus muttered. "All ships, weapons free. Remember, we want prisoners for questioning." The battle, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The Zenth ships were built for raids against defenseless targets, not combat against a prepared military force. Their weapons were designed to intimidate. Their armor was intended to stop desperate, improvised attacks by desperate civilians. Against human warships that had been specifically designed to kill other warships, they might as well have been throwing rocks. When the firing stopped, 12 Zenth vessels were floating dead in space, their crews unconscious from emergency stasis fields that had activated when their ship systems failed. The remaining 6 vessels had surrendered after watching their compatriots get systematically dismantled by weapons they couldn't even see until they hit. "Surface team, report." Marcus called to the ground forces that had deployed as soon as the orbital threat was eliminated. "Settlement Gamma 7 is secure, Captain," came the response from Major Torres. "We've captured 47 Zenth raiders alive, neutralized 16 who resisted, and freed approximately 300 Deltari civilians. Medical teams are treating the wounded. Casualties? None among our forces, sir." The Zenth weren't prepared for orbital insertion under hostile fire. Marcus nodded. Of course they weren't. Who would be, in a galaxy that had forgotten how warfare actually worked? "Captain," Lieutenant Kim spoke up from her position. "I'm receiving multiple transmissions from across this sector. Other Deltari colonies are reporting Zenth fleets approaching their positions. It looks like this was a coordinated attack on multiple settlements." Marcus studied his tactical display. 6 other human task forces were already moving to intercept, but the scale of the Zenth operation was larger than intelligence had suggested. This wasn't just raiding. This was invasion. "Kim, patch me through to Admiral Harrison." The holographic image of Admiral Rebecca Harrison materialized on the command deck, her expression grim as she reviewed the same intelligence data Marcus was seeing. "Captain Rodriguez," she said without preamble, "I hope you're ready for a long day. We're tracking Zenth fleets moving against 17 different colonies across this sector. This is the largest coordinated attack we've seen them attempt. Orders, Admiral, same as before. Stop them. Save the civilians. Take prisoners when possible." "But Marcus," her expression grew even more serious. "The Galactic Council is monitoring our communications. They're demanding we withdraw immediately and allow them to handle this through proper diplomatic channels." Marcus felt his temper flare. "Admiral, with respect, the proper diplomatic channels just got 300 people captured and nearly executed while the Council debated whether to form a subcommittee." "I know, Captain. And that's exactly what I told Council Moderator Veth Kyle when he contacted me an hour ago. I also told him that Earth considers these attacks an act of aggression against our allies, and we will respond accordingly." "How did he take that?" Admiral Harrison's smile was not pleasant. "About as well as you'd expect. He informed me that unauthorized military action violates 17 different galactic peace treaties and could result in Earth being expelled from the Council entirely." "And your response?" "I told him that if the Council was more concerned with unauthorized military action than with stopping mass murder, then maybe Earth didn't want to be part of the Council anyway." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his species. Finally, someone was saying what needed to be said. "Admiral, are we prepared for the consequences of this? If the Council decides to act against Earth?" "Marcus, the Council hasn't authorized military action in over a century. They're not going to start now, especially not against a member species that's actually stopping genocide while they're still forming committees to discuss it. The worst they can do is expel us from their endless meetings. And if other species decide to intervene against us, Admiral Harrison's expression grew cold. Then, they'll learn the same lesson the Zenth are learning. Peace through strength works both ways. You can choose to be strong enough to protect the innocent, or you can choose to be strong enough to destroy those who threaten them. We're giving the galaxy a demonstration of both. The communication link closed, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his orders. Around him, the crew of the Defiance worked with the efficient professionalism that had made humanity's military feared even during the peaceful decades of Council membership. "Captain," Kim reported, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Settlement Gamma 7. The Deltari Colonial Administrator wants to speak with you personally." The holographic image that appeared was that of a Deltari female, her insectoid features showing the exhaustion and relief of someone who had just survived a nightmare. Her translated voice carried emotional undertones that the Universal Translation System struggled to convey. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, her words carefully chosen, "I am Administrator Zekth of Settlement Gamma 7. On behalf of my people, I want to thank you for what you have done today. The Zenth would have killed us all if you had not arrived. We're glad we could help." "Administrator," Marcus replied. "Are your people safe?" "Yes, thanks to your soldiers. But, Captain, I must tell you something. The Galactic Council contacted us this morning. They informed us that we should not resist the Zenth attacks, as resistance would complicate their efforts to negotiate a peaceful resolution." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "They told you not to resist. They said that any defensive action on our part would be seen as provocation and might cause the Zenth to escalate their attacks. They advised us to comply with Zenth demands while they worked through proper channels to address the situation." The silence on the command deck was deafening. Every human present understood exactly what that meant. The Galactic Council hadn't just been delaying action against the Zenth. They've been actively preventing their victims from defending themselves. "Administrator," Marcus said carefully, "how long ago did the Council give you this advice?" 6 months ago, Captain, when the raids first began." 6 months. The Council had known about the Zenth attacks for 6 months, and, instead of stopping them, they had told the victims to submit peacefully while they formed committees to study the situation. "Thank you for that information, Administrator," Marcus said. "We'll make sure the appropriate people hear about it." As the communication ended, Marcus turned to his navigation officer. "Set course for the Galactic Council chambers," he ordered. "Best possible speed." "Sir, but we have orders to continue operations against the Zenth fleets." Marcus looked at the tactical display, showing Zenth forces moving against helpless colonies while the galaxy's governments actively prevented resistance. "The Zenth are a symptom," he said quietly. "It's time to address the disease." The Galactic Council's emergency session was the largest gathering in its 300-year history. Species that hadn't sent representatives to the regular negotiations for decades had dispatched their most senior diplomats. The great crystalline chamber hummed with tension as 487 different civilizations tried to comprehend what humanity had done. Council moderator Vethkyle floated in his elevated position at the center of the chaos, his crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lighting in patterns that suggested barely controlled panic. Around him, delegates spoke in urgent clusters, their translated voices creating a cacophony of confusion and outrage. "Order! Order!" Vethkyle's voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic systems. "This emergency session will address the unprecedented actions taken by the Terran military forces in violation of established galactic peace protocols." Ambassador Sarah Chun sat in the human delegation section, calmly reviewing the datapad in her hands while 487 species argued about her people's actions. She had returned to the council chambers not as a supplicant seeking approval, but as a representative delivering a report on completed operations. The difference was significant, and everyone in the chamber could feel it. "The floor recognizes the Valkyrie delegation," Vethkyle announced, his voice carrying undertones of relief at having an established protocol to follow. The Valkyrie ambassador rose on its multiple tentacles, each one writhing with agitation. Its translated voice carried the moral certainty that had made its species influential in council politics for generations. Moderator, fellow delegates, we face an unprecedented crisis. The Terran military has engaged in unauthorized warfare against the Xenth Confederation, resulting in the destruction of 18 vessels and the death or capture of over 600 individuals. These actions were taken without council approval, without proper diplomatic consultation, and in direct violation of treaties that have maintained galactic peace for 3 centuries. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Several species began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a crescendo of diplomatic outrage. Furthermore, the Valkyrie ambassador continued. Human forces have occupied 7 planetary systems, established military checkpoints along major trade routes, and declared what they term protection zones around dozens of colonies without the consent of the governments involved. This is nothing less than military imperialism disguised as humanitarian intervention. The murmurs grew louder. Sarah looked up from her datapad and made a note. The Valkyrie had done their homework, but they were still missing the point entirely. The Threne delegation demands immediate explanation for these violations, squawked the avian representative, his feathers ruffled with indignation. The precedent being set threatens the very foundation of civilized discourse. The Gromax collective echoes these concerns, boomed the massive slug-like ambassador, its skin patterns flashing colors that the translation system rendered as profound disapproval. Military action without consensus undermines the authority of this council and threatens the stability of all peaceful relationships. Veth Kyle gestured for silence as the complaints continued to mount. The floor recognizes Ambassador Chun of the Terran delegation. Sarah stood slowly, gathering her papers with deliberate care. Around her, the chamber fell into an expectant quiet that felt more like the silence before a storm than the respectful attention usually given to speakers. "Thank you, moderator," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I've listened to the concerns raised by my colleagues, and I believe there may be some confusion about recent events. Allow me to provide clarity." She activated a holographic display above the central platform, showing a 3-dimensional map of the affected sectors. Red markers indicated recent Xenth attacks, yellow markers showed human military positions, and blue markers represented civilian populations. 6 months ago, the Xenth Confederation began systematic raids against civilian settlements in 14 different sectors. These raids involved the capture, enslavement, and often murder of non-combatant populations. The affected settlements appealed to this council for protection. The display zoomed in on specific attack sites, showing the scope and brutality of the Xenth operations. The images were stark and undeniable. This council's response was to advise the victims not to resist while committees were formed to study the situation. During the 6 months those committees have been meeting, the Xenth have attacked 47 settlements, captured over 12,000 civilians, and killed an estimated 3,000 people who were deemed unsuitable for slavery. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the background hum of translation systems seemed muted. 3 days ago, human forces intervened to stop these attacks. In 72 hours of operations, we liberated 31 settlements, freed over 8,000 civilians, and eliminated the Xenth's capability to continue their raids. Total human casualties, 0. Total civilian casualties during our operations, 0. Sarah paused to let those numbers sink in. The Xenth forces we engaged were given opportunities to surrender. Those who did were taken prisoner and will be returned to their government with the understanding that future attacks on civilian populations will result in more decisive action. Those who chose to fight were destroyed. The Valkyrie ambassador's tentacles writhed frantically. Ambassador Chun, you cannot simply justify military aggression with results. The means matter as much as the ends. By what authority did humanity undertake these operations? Sarah looked directly at the Valkyrie delegate. By the authority granted to any civilized species when they witness genocide and choose not to stand by while it happens. That brought an explosion of voices from around the chamber. Multiple species began shouting simultaneously, their translated protests creating a wall of sound that the acoustic systems struggled to parse. Unauthorized warfare, violation of sovereignty, precedent for chaos, military imperialism. Vethkal called for order repeatedly before the noise finally died down to a manageable level of outraged muttering. Ambassador Chun, he said, his crystalline voice carrying notes of strained patience. Surely you understand that however noble your intentions, the precedent you have set is dangerous. If every species decides to take military action whenever they disapprove of another species' behavior, the peace we have maintained will collapse entirely. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Moderator, you raise an excellent point about precedent. Let's examine the precedent this council has established during the same period. The holographic display changed, now showing a timeline of galactic conflicts over the past century. The Zalanki extinction, 6 years of committee meetings while corporate mining operations poisoned an entire species to death. Final council action, a strongly worded letter of concern delivered after the last Zalanki died. The display shifted. The Korthani slave trade, 47 years of negotiations with a species that was literally selling sentient beings in public markets. Final council action, a trade agreement that recognized slavery as a cultural practice deserving of respect. More data appeared. The Nexari territorial expansion, 28 years of diplomatic discussions while one species systematically conquered 12 others through what they called economic integration. Final council action, official recognition of the new borders after the conquered species ceased to exist as independent entities. The chamber was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Less righteous, more uncomfortable. The precedent this council has established, Sarah continued, is that any species can commit any atrocity as long as they're willing to participate in endless discussions about it. You've created a system where the only way to avoid council action is to make sure your victims can't appeal for help. That is a gross mischaracterization, the Gromax ambassador protested, its skin flashing angry red patterns. The council has successfully mediated thousands of disputes. Name one, Sarah said immediately. The same uncomfortable pause that had followed this challenge months ago when she first asked the question. Around the chamber, delegates looked at each other with the growing realization that they couldn't actually answer. The important thing, Vethkal said quickly, is that we address the current crisis. Ambassador Chun, what does humanity want? Sarah smiled, and something about that expression made every being in the chamber suddenly very nervous. We want the council to do its job, she said simply. We want you to actually protect innocent people instead of protecting the bureaucratic processes that prevent you from protecting innocent people. And if the council refuses, then you'll continue to be irrelevant while humanity and our allies handle the problems you won't. The explosion of outraged voices was even louder this time. Sarah waited patiently for it to die down before continuing. Let me be very clear about what humanity has learned during our 57 years of participation in this council. You don't actually solve problems. You manage them. You contain them. You delay them until everyone involved either gives up or dies. You've created a system where the only acceptable response to evil is to form a committee to study whether it's really evil. And by the time you reach a conclusion, the evil has accomplished its goals. She gestured toward the holographic display, still showing the timeline of council failures. The Zinth raids would have continued for years while you debated proper responses. The Deltari would have been extinct before your subcommittee reached its preliminary conclusions. Every day you delayed, real people suffered real consequences. So yes, we set a precedent. The precedent that when this council fails to protect innocent people, someone else will. The precedent that genocide is not acceptable regardless of how many diplomatic protocols the perpetrators follow. The precedent that sometimes the only way to achieve peace is to first defeat those who profit from violence. The Valkyrie ambassador's tentacles had stopped writhing and now hung limply around its body. Ambassador Chun, Surely you must see that this path leads to chaos. If every species decides when military force is justified, every species already decides that, Sarah interrupted. The difference is that most of you have decided that military force is never justified, even to stop atrocities. Humanity has decided that military force is sometimes necessary, specifically to stop atrocities. And who decides what constitutes an atrocity worthy of intervention? Demanded the Threen representative. Sarah's expression hardened. Anyone with a functioning moral compass and the courage to act on it. The chamber erupted again, but this time Sarah didn't wait for quiet. She raised her voice to carry over the noise. This council has had 300 years to prove that peaceful negotiation can protect innocent people from those who choose violence. Your record speaks for itself. Dozens of species extinct, millions of individuals enslaved, murdered, or displaced. Countless atrocities ignored because stopping them would require decisive action. She gathered her papers and stood to leave. Humanity is withdrawing from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. We will no longer participate in an organization that treats genocide as a matter for committee study. We will continue to protect our allies and any other species that requests our assistance against those who target civilians. Ambassador, Veth Kyle's voice cracked with desperation. You cannot simply leave. There are procedures, protocols. This requires formal review. Sarah stopped at the exit and turned back one last time. Moderator, with respect, your procedures and protocols have failed. They failed the Zelenki, the Korthani victims, the conquered Nexri territories, the Deltari colonies, and every other group that trusted this council to protect them. They failed because they're designed to prevent action, not enable it. Humanity is done waiting for permission to do what's right. The galaxy can choose to join us in actually solving problems, or it can continue to form committees to study them. Either way, innocent people will be protected. The chamber doors closed behind her with the same finality as they had months earlier, but this time the silence that followed was different. This time, it was the silence of beings who were beginning to understand that the galaxy had changed, and they had failed to change with it. In the void left by humanity's departure, 487 species were left to contemplate a universe where some problems were solved with action instead of discussion. Most of them found the idea terrifying. Some of them found it inspiring. All of them understood that the age of endless negotiation was coming to an end. Admiral Rebecca Harrison stood on the observation deck of the U.S. Constitution, watching the construction of what would soon be known as the first independent defense station in galactic history. The massive structure was taking shape in the space between the Deltari home system and the former Zenth raiding bases, a clear statement that some things were worth defending with more than words. 6 months had passed since humanity's final withdrawal from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy was learning to adapt to a new reality. A reality where problems were solved instead of managed, where protection was offered instead of promised, and where the phrase, "we'll form a committee to study it," had become a punchline in 17 different languages. Admiral, Captain Rodriguez approached from the command section, a data pad in his hands, and an expression that suggested both good and troubling news. Latest intelligence reports from our monitoring stations. Rebecca took the pad and reviewed the information flowing across its screen. The data painted a complex picture of a galaxy in transition, some parts adapting to change better than others. The Velkari are mobilizing their fleet? She asked, noting the military buildup markers scattered across their territory. Yes, ma'am. They've tripled their defense spending in the last 4 months and begun construction of 12 new battleships. Intelligence suggests they're planning to enforce council resolutions through military action. Rebecca nodded grimly. The Velkari had always been the council's most vocal supporters, and they seemed to view humanity's departure as a personal insult. Their species had built their entire identity around the belief that all conflicts could be resolved through patient negotiation, and humans had proved that belief wrong in the most public way possible. What about the others? Mixed reactions, Marcus replied, scrolling through the data. The Threen and Gromax are supporting the Valkyrie position, but they're not contributing ships or resources. Classic council behavior, really. Lots of vocal support, no actual commitment. And the smaller species? Marcus's expression brightened slightly. That's where it gets interesting, Admiral. 43 species have formally requested protection agreements with Earth. Not trade deals, not diplomatic recognition. Protection agreements. They want what the Deltari got. Rebecca studied the list of requesting species. Most were small civilizations that had been ignored by the Council for decades, their problems deemed too minor for official attention. Others were larger groups that had been slowly absorbed by more aggressive neighbors, while the Council debated proper responses. The Altari want us to stop Gromax's corporate expansion into their territory, she read aloud. The Kresh are asking for help with Nexari economic integration efforts. The Zelani coalition wants protection from systematic displacement by mining operations. All problems the Council has been aware of for years, Marcus added. Some for decades. None of them deemed worthy of action. Rebecca handed back the datapad and returned to studying the construction work outside. The defense station was more than just a military installation. It was a symbol, a statement that some species had found an alternative to endless negotiation. How many ships do we have available for protection operations? She asked. Currently deployed? 37 vessels across 14 sectors. Admiral Chen's task force is handling the Altari situation. Admiral Morrison is dealing with the Nexari expansion, and Admiral Rodriguez's group is finishing cleanup of the remaining Zent holdouts. And our shipyards? Working at full capacity. We're launching 2 new vessels every week, and the Deltari have begun contributing their own ships to joint operations. The Kresh have offered their manufacturing capabilities in exchange for protection, and 6 other species have made similar arrangements. Rebecca felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Humanity had proven that their approach worked, but success brought its own challenges. Each species they helped wanted protection from their particular oppressors, and the list of oppressors was longer than anyone had imagined. Admiral, Marcus continued, there's something else. The Council has issued what they're calling an enforcement resolution regarding unauthorized military activities. They're demanding that all species cease cooperation with human protection operations. And the response? 19 species have publicly refused to comply. They're calling it the Harrison Doctrine after your statement that protection is a basic right, not a privilege to be granted by committee. Rebecca smiled despite herself. She hadn't intended to create a doctrine, just state an obvious truth. But if other species wanted to adopt the idea that innocent people deserve protection from those who would harm them, she wouldn't complain about the naming rights. What's our assessment of Valkyrie military capabilities? She asked, returning to the more immediate concern. Impressive on paper, potentially problematic in practice, Marcus replied. They have the industrial capacity to build a significant fleet, and their technology is advanced. But, Admiral, they haven't fought a real war in over 200 years. Their entire military doctrine is based on showing force to encourage negotiation, not actually winning battles. Whereas we've been fighting actual battles against actual enemies for the past 6 months. Exactly. Plus, our intelligence suggests their fleet commanders are chosen for diplomatic skills rather than tactical ability. They're used to commanding parade formations and escort duties, not combat operations. A communication alert interrupted their discussion. The holographic image of Ambassador Chan materialized on the observation deck, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just received particularly good news. Admiral Harrison, Sarah said without preamble, I thought you'd want to know about the latest council session immediately. What's the situation, Ambassador? The Valkyrie formally presented their enforcement resolution, demanding that all species cease cooperation with human protection operations. The vote was 437 species in favor, 12 opposed, 38 abstaining. Rebecca frowned. Those aren't encouraging numbers. Sarah's smile widened. That's where it gets interesting. Immediately after the vote, 67 species formally withdrew from the Council. Not just opposition to the resolution. Complete withdrawal. They're calling it the second human exodus. Marcus whistled softly. 67 species? That's almost 15% of the entire Council. Including some major ones, Sarah continued. The Altari brought 7 allied systems with them. The Kresh convinced their entire trade confederation to leave. Even 3 former council members followed us out. Rebecca felt the implications beginning to sink in. What's the council's response? Panic mostly. Moderator Veth Kyle called an emergency session to address the crisis of galactic unity. The Valkyrie ambassador demanded immediate military action to prevent further withdrawals. The Gromax suggested forming a subcommittee to study the situation. A subcommittee? Of course they did. It gets better, Sarah said, her expression turning serious. The withdrawing species have requested a meeting to discuss alternatives to council membership. They want to create what they're calling a defense alliance based on the principle that protection is a responsibility, not a privilege. Rebecca looked at Marcus, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. Humanity had intended to solve a specific problem with the Zenth raids. Instead, they had accidentally started a revolution in how galactic civilization approached justice and protection. Where do they want to meet? She asked. They've suggested the new defense station once construction is complete. Symbolic location, they said. The first structure built specifically to protect people rather than to house committees. Rebecca nodded slowly. The defense station had been intended as a simple military installation. Now, it was becoming the potential capital of a new kind of galactic organization. Admiral, Marcus spoke up. What about the Valkyrie threat? If they're really planning military action, then they'll learn the same lesson the Zenth learned, Rebecca replied. The difference between threatening force and using it effectively. She turned back to the window, watching the defense station take shape against the backdrop of stars. Each section that was completed brought them closer to a future where protection was guaranteed rather than negotiated, where justice was enforced rather than discussed, where the phrase, someone should do something, was followed by someone actually doing something. Sarah, she said to the holographic ambassador, tell the withdrawing species we'll host their meeting. And tell them we're honored to be part of whatever they decide to build. What should I say about the Council's enforcement resolution? Rebecca considered the question carefully. The Galactic Council had just voted to demand that species stop seeking protection from those who would harm them. The moral bankruptcy of that position was so obvious it hardly needed commentary. Tell them that humanity recognizes only one authority when it comes to protection of innocent people: the moral obligation to act when action is needed. If the Council wants to enforce a resolution that prevents people from defending themselves and others, they're welcome to try. And if the Valkyrie fleet actually attacks us, then the galaxy will learn that some principles are worth fighting for, and some species are better at fighting than others. The communication link closed, leaving Rebecca and Marcus alone with their thoughts and the growing shape of the defense station. Around them, the work of building something new continued, each completed section a step away from a galaxy governed by committee and toward one protected by conviction. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, are we starting a war? Rebecca watched a team of human and Deltari engineers working together to install defensive systems that would actually defend rather than simply deter. Marcus, the war started when the first innocent person was killed, while committees debated whether they deserved protection. We're just finishing it. In the distance, the navigation lights of the first ships from the withdrawing species began to appear, their crews coming to help build something the galaxy had never seen before, a government that measured success by problems solved rather than committees formed. The Galactic Council had voted to prevent that government from existing. The universe was about to discover which approach would prove more effective. The Battle of New Haven lasted exactly 18 minutes. Historians would later call it the shortest decisive engagement in galactic military history, though they would spend decades debating whether the real victory was the battle itself or what came after. Admiral Rebecca Harrison watched the tactical display from the command center of the U.S. Constitution as the last Valkyrie battleship powered down its weapons and transmitted its surrender. Around her, the bridge crew maintained their professional composure despite having just witnessed the end of 3 centuries of galactic political structure. Final count, Admiral Captain Rodriguez reported from his position at the tactical station. 17 Valkyrie vessels disabled, 3 destroyed when they refused to surrender, 41 vessels captured intact along with their crews. 0 Allied casualties. Rebecca nodded, though her expression remained grim. The numbers told the story of a battle that had been over before it began, but they didn't capture the significance of what had just happened. The Galactic Council had finally authorized military force after 3 centuries of endless negotiation, and their chosen enforcers had been comprehensively defeated by the very people they were supposed to punish. Communications, she called to Lieutenant Kim. Signal all Valkyrie vessels. Medical assistance is available for their wounded, and their crews will be repatriated to their home systems once we've completed our discussions with their government. Yes, ma'am. Admiral, I'm also receiving priority transmissions from across the galaxy. News of the battle is spreading faster than our jamming can contain it. Rebecca had expected that. The Valkyrie attack on the New Haven defense station had been broadcast live by 17 different news services, partly because the Valkyrie had wanted to demonstrate their enforcement of Council resolutions, and partly because they had expected a quick victory that would discourage further withdrawals from the Council. Instead, they had provided the galaxy with a stark demonstration of the difference between a military that existed for show and a military that existed to fight. What's the general reaction? Rebecca asked. Mixed, but trending heavily in our favor, Kim replied, scanning the incoming data streams. 43 more species have formally withdrawn from the Council in the past hour. The Council itself is an emergency session, and several member species are demanding moderator Veth Kyle's resignation. And the Valkyrie government, requesting immediate negotiations regarding the return of their personnel and vessels. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. After 18 minutes of actual combat, the Valkyrie were suddenly very interested in negotiation. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Tell them we'll be happy to discuss terms, but any negotiations will include representatives from the 67 species that withdrew from the Council, as well as any others who choose to join us. The holographic image of Ambassador Sarah Chun materialized in the command center, her expression showing the controlled excitement of someone who had just watched impossible things become inevitable. Admiral, Sarah said without preamble, I've just finished a very interesting conversation with moderator Veth Kyle. The Council is prepared to offer significant concessions in exchange for humanity's return to the negotiation process. What kind of concessions? Immediate authorization for limited military intervention in cases of what they term extreme humanitarian crisis. Expedited committee processes for urgent situations. Enhanced voting rights for species that contribute military assets to enforcement operations. Rebecca studied Sarah's expression, looking for some sign of whether the ambassador thought these offers were worth considering. What she saw was the carefully neutral face of a diplomat who had learned to hide her contempt behind professional courtesy. Your assessment, Ambassador? They're offering to reform a system that can't be reformed. Limited military intervention means they'll still spend months debating whether a situation qualifies. Expedited committee processes means the committees will deliberate for weeks instead of months. Enhanced voting rights means the species that do the actual work get slightly more influence over the species that prevent them from working. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. Admiral, they're offering to make a broken system slightly less broken in exchange for legitimacy they no longer possess. And your recommendation? That we politely decline and continue building something that actually works. Rebecca turned back to the tactical display, where the defeated Valkyrie fleet hung motionless in space. 41 vessels and their crews, all serving a government that had just learned the difference between theoretical authority and practical power. Kim, open a channel to all ships, all frequencies. Galaxy-wide broadcast. Channel open, Admiral. Rebecca took a moment to consider her words carefully. What she said next would be heard by billions of beings across hundreds of worlds, and would likely determine the shape of galactic civilization for generations to come. This is Admiral Rebecca Harrison of the United Earth-Ship Constitution, speaking on behalf of the Defense Alliance of Free Worlds. 18 minutes ago, the Galactic Council authorized military action against the New Haven Defense Station in an attempt to enforce their resolution prohibiting species from seeking protection from those who would harm them. She paused, letting that sink in across the galaxy. The Council sent a fleet of military vessels to attack a defensive installation because they objected to the idea that innocent people deserve protection. They launched this attack not to stop aggression, not to prevent genocide, not to defend the helpless, but to preserve a system that prevents others from doing those things. The tactical display showed ships throughout the galaxy slowing to listen to the broadcast, including vessels from species that were still officially Council members. The battle is over. The Valkyrie fleet has been defeated with minimal loss of life on their side, and no casualties among Alliance forces. Their crews will be returned safely to their homes once appropriate arrangements have been made. But more importantly, this battle has demonstrated something that 3 centuries of committee meetings could not, that there's a fundamental difference between organizations that exist to prevent action and organizations that exist to enable it. Rebecca gestured toward the tactical display, though she knew her audience couldn't see it. The Defense Alliance of Free Worlds stands for a simple principle: that protection is a basic right, not a privilege to be granted by committee. That justice delayed is justice denied. That sometimes the only way to achieve peace is to first defeat those who profit from violence. We invite any species, any government, any organization that shares these principles to join us in building a galaxy where innocent people are protected because it's the right thing to do, not because it's been properly authorized by the appropriate subcommittee. She took a breath, preparing for the words that would formally end the old order. The Galactic Council has had 3 centuries to prove that endless negotiation can protect innocent people from those who choose violence. Their own actions today demonstrate that they have chosen to become the very thing they claim to prevent: aggressors who use force to impose their will on others. Effective immediately, the Defense Alliance considers itself the legitimate government of any species that chooses protection over process, action over discussion, justice over bureaucracy. We invite the galaxy to choose the future it wants to inhabit. Rebecca gestured to Kim to close the channel, then turned to address her bridge crew. Status of Alliance fleet: full deployment across 47 systems, Admiral Marcus reported. All protection agreements are being honored. All territorial integrity is being maintained. All civilian populations are secure. Council response: emergency session called for immediate session. Preliminary reports suggest significant defections among member species. The Gromax Collective has reportedly suspended their delegation, and the Threen are demanding a vote of no confidence in the moderator. Rebecca nodded. The Council was finally experiencing the consequences of their own choices, and they were learning that authority without effectiveness was just elaborate decoration. Admiral, Sarah's holographic image, spoke up. I'm receiving reports from our embassy staff throughout Council space. Spontaneous celebrations have broken out on over 200 worlds. Species that have been ignored by the Council for decades are declaring their independence and requesting Alliance membership. How many? Current count is 137 species requesting membership, with more applications arriving every few minutes. Rebecca felt the magnitude of the moment settling around her. Humanity had set out to solve a simple problem with Zenth raiders, and had instead accidentally triggered the collapse of the galaxy's oldest political institution. Marcus, she called to her tactical officer, what's the status of former Council enforcement capabilities? Effectively neutralized, Admiral. The Valkyrie were their primary military arm, and their fleet is currently floating helplessly in space around us. The other council species have primarily ceremonial forces designed for parades and escort duties. So, if we wanted to, we could prevent them from taking any military action against withdrawing species. Admiral, if we wanted to, we could prevent them from taking any action at all. Their entire system depended on voluntary compliance backed by the threat of Valkyrie intervention. With the Valkyrie fleet captured and their enforcement capability eliminated, the Council has no way to compel anyone to do anything. Rebecca considered this information carefully. Power that couldn't be enforced wasn't really power at all. It was just the illusion of authority maintained by social convention. And social conventions had a way of disappearing quickly when they were tested against reality. "Open a channel to the Valkyrie fleet commander," she ordered. The holographic image of a tall, elegant being with multiple graceful tentacles appeared before her. Its expression was impossible to read, but its posture suggested the resignation of someone who had just learned that their entire worldview was based on false assumptions. "Admiral Harrison," the Valkyrie commander said in accented but clear Standard Galactic. "I am Fleet Commander Zarthok. I wish to discuss terms for the return of my personnel." "Commander," Rebecca replied formally, "your crews are safe and will be returned to Valkyrie space unharmed. However, I'd like to understand something. Your government ordered you to attack a defensive installation protecting civilian populations. Did you question those orders?" The Valkyrie commander's tentacles shifted in what Rebecca had learned was their equivalent of shrug. The Galactic Council voted to authorize enforcement action. The decision was unanimous among participating members. Our role was to implement the will of civilized society. "Commander, with respect, the will of civilized society should be to protect innocent people, not to attack those who provide that protection. Admiral, you must understand. The system we serve has maintained peace for 3 centuries. Your actions threaten that stability." Rebecca studied the Valkyrie commander's expression, seeing genuine conviction behind the alien features. This was a being who truly believed that the Council's endless delays and committee formations represented the pinnacle of civilized behavior. "Commander, in those 3 centuries of peace, how many species went extinct while the Council debated whether they deserved help?" The question hung in the air unanswered. How many civilizations were enslaved while committees studied whether slavery violated cultural autonomy? How many worlds were poisoned while subcommittees determined whether environmental protection infringed on economic rights? The Valkyrie commander's silence was answer enough. "Your system didn't maintain peace, Commander. It maintained the appearance of peace by ensuring that victims couldn't fight back while they were being victimized. That's not civilization. That's complicity." Rebecca terminated the connection and turned to address her crew. "All ships, this is Admiral Harrison. Begin Phase 2 operations. Protection protocols are now in effect for any world requesting Alliance membership. Anyone who threatens civilian populations will be treated as hostile combatants." She looked out at the stars visible through the command center's viewports, knowing that somewhere among them, the galaxy was choosing its future. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said quietly, "we've just become the government. Let's make sure we do a better job than the people we replaced." In the months that followed, historians would mark this moment as the end of the age of committees and the beginning of the age of action. The Galactic Council would continue to meet for several more years, but with each passing month they represented fewer species and wielded less influence, until finally their last session was attended by only 7 delegates arguing about who should turn off the lights. The Defense Alliance of Free Worlds, meanwhile, grew from 67 founding members to over 400 species united by the simple principle that protection was a responsibility, not a privilege. And throughout the galaxy, children grew up in a universe where injustice was something that was stopped rather than studied, where genocide was prevented rather than mourned, and where the phrase "someone should do something" was consistently followed by someone actually doing something. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.